This is the only horror movie that brings back memories of my childhood nightmares because it is adapted from terrifying folk stories that were often told to us as kids, just like the ghost stories we used to hear. In this film, there are a total of 5 stories, each featuring a truly horrifying monster. Every time these monsters make an appearance, it sends shivers down your spine. It is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which will be released in 2019. The story begins on Halloween night in 1968 when a group of fearless youngsters embarks on an adventure to explore an abandoned castle that has been sealed for a century. To set the eerie mood, Stella starts recounting the tales associated with this place as they enter the castle. Legend has it that the castle's owner was a wealthy figure in the town, and he had a daughter named Sarah. Due to a strange illness, Sarah was confined to her home by her father and never allowed to leave. Even though the town's children had never seen Sarah, they could always hear her telling horrifying stories from behind the walls. Strangely, anyone who listened to her terrifying tales invariably disappeared. Even if they didn't disappear, they all died in accidents when they got home. The townspeople blamed Sarah for these tragedies and decided to seek revenge. However, when they arrived at her home, they found Sarah hanging lifeless, and even more eerie, her entire family had vanished. Since then, the castle became an abandoned, foreboding place where no one dared to tread, and Sarah's horrifying stories continued to haunt the town. It was said that if you visited the castle after dark and asked Sarah to tell you a scary story, she would grant your wish. However, it would be the last story you'd ever hear in your life. Of course, these young adventurers didn't take the legend seriously and started fooling around in the room. Chuck was hiding in a wardrobe, trying to scare Augie, who was following him. Soon, he heard some noises outside, and when Chuck opened the wardrobe, something terrifying occurred. The once decrepit and dirty room had suddenly transformed into a clean, well-lit space. An eerie old lady sat on the bed, and a black dog stared intently at the wardrobe. As Chuck watched in horror, the old lady slowly turned her head towards him, panicked. Chuck hastily closed the wardrobe. Was it all just an illusion? However, before Chuck could calm down, he heard footsteps approaching from outside, and the wardrobe was abruptly thrown open. It was Augie who had found his way there. Strangely, the bright room reverted to its original state as well. Chuck, now frightened, decided to gather everyone and leave the castle as quickly as possible. At this moment, Stella's voice echoed from the basement, calling for the two of them to hurry down because there was something fun inside. Just a few minutes ago, Ramon and Stella had accidentally opened a hidden door, discovering that it was the very place where Sarah had been imprisoned. On one of the shelves, they find a horrific storybook written by Sarah, which is said to have been written in the blood of those missing children. Chuck's pretty scared after what just happened. He urged Stella to put the book back where it belonged and leave immediately. But then the door to the basement suddenly closed, and everyone started to panic. However, they soon realized it was a false alarm. It turned out that Tommy, who often bullied them, had deliberately closed the door from outside. Along with Tommy was Chuck's sister, Ruth. Ruth tried to plead with Tommy, fearing for her brother's safety, but Tommy callously kicked her into the basement and locked the door behind him before walking away, satisfied with his cruelty. However, none of them noticed that Stella, standing alone on the side, had been deeply captivated by the stories within the book. Unbeknownst to her friends, she uttered the fateful words,
"Sarah Bellows, tell me a story."
As soon as the words left his mouth, the chair on the side actually reacted. Little did they know that, at that very moment, a mysterious force was spreading through the walls, helping them unlock the sealed door. The bewildered group emerged from the basement, only to find no one in sight. They decided to leave the place without dwelling on the strange occurrence. Stella took the storybook back with her, and when she got home, she read it with curiosity. But when she reached the last story, something bizarre happened. The writing appeared fresh, as though it had just been written, and the protagonist of the story was none other than Tommy. The story went like this. Tommy had an intense dislike for the scarecrow in the cornfield, and something dreadful was about to happen when he had to go to the barn to fetch some eggs. Coincidentally, the Tommy who bullied them also harbored a strong resentment toward his family's scarecrow, using it as an outlet for his anger whenever he could. And at that very moment, the Tommy who had just returned from the castle was instructed to fetch eggs from the barn. As he passed through the cornfield, Tommy instinctively kicked the scarecrow, but to his surprise, it reappeared in front of him moments later. Thinking he might have taken a wrong turn, Tommy continued forward, only to find himself back where he had started. This time, the scarecrow on the wooden post had vanished. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Tommy quickened his pace to exit the cornfield, but, to his horror, the scarecrow suddenly reappeared in the middle of his path. Tommy, startled, tried to flee but stumbled over a pitchfork on the ground due to his panic. With the scarecrow closing in, Tommy grabbed the pitchfork and attempted to fend it off, but it proved ineffective. Scarecrow fights back, pitchforking into Tommy's body. Injured Tommy staggers out of the cornfield, desperately begging his mother for help. But in the next second, his wound began to sprout straw, and the creeping straw overtook his features. In excruciating agony, Tommy was gradually transformed into the very thing he despised, an inanimate scarecrow in the cornfield. The next day, upon learning that Tommy had indeed gone missing, Stella and Ramon headed to the cornfield. When they saw the scarecrow wearing the same clothes as Tommy, Stella knew it was him. So that night, she returned the storybook to the castle, but it didn't end there. Just after returning home, Stella found Ramon flipping through the same storybook and claiming to have taken it from the nearby bookshelf. Stella was perplexed because she was sure she had returned it to the castle, yet when Stella opened the storybook again, she discovered that the last page was once more automatically writing itself. Stella immediately tore it off, but it proved futile. No matter how many pages she tore, the story continued to write itself, and they could only watch as it unfolded, until they noticed that this time the protagonist was Augie. Stella urgently tried to reach Augie via the walkie-talkie and warned him not to eat anything. However, when Augie received the message, he was in the midst of enjoying dinner, but soon, Augie began to feel something was off, and when he vomited, he found a human toe among the contents. Augie felt nauseated. According to the storybook, the owner of the toe would soon come for Augie. Stella urged Augie to leave the house immediately. Unexpectedly, as soon as she spoke, the lights in the house went out. Terrified, Augie retreated to his bedroom, but clear footsteps were approaching from outside. Suddenly, a zombie-like figure resembling a woman appeared at the end of the hallway, repeatedly muttering, "Who's got my big toe?" Augie had no choice but to hide under the bed. In the next second, the door of the room was slowly opened. Augie dared not look, but after a few minutes, the footsteps abruptly ceased, and there was nothing to be seen in the room. Augie thought the monster had left, so he prepared to emerge from under the bed. However, as he did so, the monster grabbed him and pulled him back in. When Stella and Ramon arrived, all they found were long claw marks under the bed. Stella felt immense guilt, blaming herself for bringing the storybook home, which ultimately led to her friend's demise. Stella realized that anyone who had been to the castle that night could potentially become the next protagonist. The four of them gathered to discuss what to do next, but Ruth wasn't convinced. She was more worried about tonight's performance and turned away. The remaining three decided to burn the storybook in an attempt to break the curse, but after burning the book for 2.5 minutes, it was still intact. In their quest for a solution, they rushed to the newspaper office to investigate Sarah's background. They discovered that Sarah's family had also been written into the storybook, explaining their sudden disappearance. At that moment, Stella noticed that the storybook had begun another story, with Ruth as the next protagonist. Unaware of the impending danger, Ruth was preparing for her performance. Suddenly, a pimple appeared on Ruth's face. She rushed to the bathroom to inspect it, but it began growing rapidly and was painful to touch. Stranger still, something seemed to be moving inside it, and a thick strand of hair emerged. Ruth attempted to pluck the hair, but it moved on its own. As Ruth panicked, a multitude of spiders burst forth from the pimple, covering her body in a matter of seconds. Fortunately, Stella and the others arrived in time to douse Ruth with a bucket of water, saving her from the brink of death. At this moment, the three of them were well aware that it would soon be their turn if they didn't stop this curse. In order to stop it, they find the nanny who used to be Sarah's nanny. Lulu was the only one who survived, so she must know something. Lulu was barely coherent and unable to communicate effectively at this point. However, her daughter provided the three with a crucial clue. Sarah didn't hang herself at home. She died in the hospital. So, the three rushed to the hospital, sneaking into the records room in secret. They hoped to find the truth about Sarah's case from her medical records. To be on the safe side, Chuck was responsible for keeping a lookout outside. After a thorough search, Stella and Ramon managed to locate Sarah's medical records and even found a recording device inside. It contained detailed accounts of Sarah's tragic ordeal. As it turned out, It wasn't Sarah who had caused the deaths of those children, but rather the paper mill owned by her father. The factory's wastewater had led to the deaths of those children. In an attempt to protect the family's reputation, they had subjected Sarah to various forms of torture, forcing her to take the blame for the entire family. Ultimately, Sarah, feeling cornered, chose to hang herself. Subsequently, they fabricated the incident as a supernatural event. However, while listening to the recording, Stella and Ramon unexpectedly heard Chuck's story being recounted. Stella sensed danger and quickly pulled out the storybook to check. They discovered that Chuck's story had indeed appeared in the book. Meanwhile, Chuck seemed to have realized the peril and was desperately trying to escape. But as the emergency lights illuminated the hospital corridor, a beautiful woman suddenly appeared at the far end. She shyly approached Chuck. Chuck doesn't like women who take the initiative, so he starts to run away. But no matter which way he goes, he can't escape from the woman's clutches. Chuck was finally forced into a desperate situation, but into the arms of the woman to become part of her body. When Stella and Ramon arrived, it was too late. All they found was Chuck's dropped pen. They were apprehended and taken to the police station for unlawfully entering the hospital. Stella told the sheriff everything, saying that the recent disappearances were all related to this storybook. But the sheriff is also an unbeliever, so he put them in the cell. However, late into the night, the fifth story unfolded as scheduled. Seeing that the writing on the book was not dry, the sheriff thought it was a prank by the two. But the next moment, the lights in the police station suddenly went out. A police dog sensed danger and kept staring at the nearby fireplace. While the sheriff curiously inspected the fireplace, suddenly, countless severed limbs and body parts began falling from above. Under the sheriff's horrified gaze, a horrible monster was formed. The sheriff was dumbfounded. Before he could react, the monster snapped his neck. Subsequently, the monster slowly advanced toward the cell, continuously calling out Ramon's name. It was clear that this story was about Ramon. The two thought they would be safe in the cell, but they didn't realize that the monster would try to get inside even if his head was squeezed out of shape. Luckily, Stella got the key from the sheriff at the last second and they were able to escape without a hitch. Ramon knows that both of them will be killed if they keep going like this, so he decides to split up. Ramon sought a way to confront the monster head-on, while Ruth rushed to Sarah's house in the hopes of finding a solution. But just as Ruth left, the monster came after her. Even with Ramon driving at full speed, he couldn't shake off the pursuing monster. Just as the monster was about to break through the car window, Ramon accelerated and crashed into a nearby truck. Taking advantage of the moment when the monster was momentarily trapped, Ramon quickly made his escape. However, the monster soon separated its body once again, breaking free from its confinement. On the other side, Stella had already arrived at the castle. She pleaded with Sarah to stop telling stories, assuring her that they knew she was innocent. But as soon as she said that, the villa turned back to its original form. Simultaneously, Ramon was chased to the castle by the monster. Although they could hear each other's voices, the scenes they witnessed were completely different. In another dimension, Stella had transformed into Sarah, experiencing Sarah's tragic ordeal firsthand. Eventually, she was also locked in the basement. As the basement lights went out, the deceased Sarah appeared on a nearby chair. She slowly stood up and approached Stella, saying that she wanted to tell Stella a story as well. At this moment, Ramon, hiding under a table, realized that only by revealing the truth could they stop Sarah. He urgently communicated with Stella through the void, imploring her to share Sarah's story. Upon hearing Ramon's words, Stella immediately addressed Sarah, expressing her intention to tell Sarah's story and reveal the truth to vindicate her. Sarah seemed moved by Stella's sincerity, and her gaze softened. Sarah took out a pen and paper and asked Stella to write down the story with her own blood on the storybook.
I was innocent. Sarah Bellows. She was harmed, destroyed by her own family, by their greed. I'll tell your story.
Touched by Stella's genuine intentions, Sarah ultimately chose to let go of her grudges. The monster that had been pursuing Ramon also disappeared alongside Sarah. In the movie's conclusion, Stella keeps her promise and writes Sarah's story in detail in a book.